I can tell there's a greatly interested crowd here. This is always scary. A quick background. There were four families who have a long and multi-generational history in China. Last year's presentations, as you remember, were really kind of a broad sweep over how the families came to China, sort of what they did there, and then how they came to Greensboro. That narrative arc you have seen at the exhibit and really was described very well last year in the presentations. Tonight's discussion is really kind of drills down a little bit, gets a little bit more fine-grained, and tells a few more specific stories that are probably too complex to really elaborate on the panels in the exhibit. As you understand, the lives were certainly uncommon and in some cases, in all cases, exceedingly interesting. I know that the video from last year is on the website, so if you want to reacquaint yourself with those stories, you can go to the GHS website. And there are some brochures in the room floating around back there, so if you want to grab one, it really gives a little bit of a detail about the exhibit. And before I introduce the panel, I do want to acknowledge the generous support of the Freeman Foundation, which made the exhibit possible. We have three representatives of the four families. Graham Freeman can't be here tonight, unfortunately. Tony has switched airports and airlines and moved countries in order to be here tonight, and we are grateful for his efforts. He's going to talk about his great-grandfather, Hunter Corbett, who was a Presbyterian missionary in northern China, and I think your grandfather, Ross Corbett, and your mother, Harriet Irwin Corbett. June's going to talk about the experience of her mother's family, the Hales, and their experience with after the Japanese invasion of China and the internment of the Westerners in a camp in Shanghai. And if I can get my notes here. Eliza Burnham is going to really talk about the extraordinary career of her grandfather, Norwood Allman, who was a consular officer, an assessor in the International Mixed Court, and a lawyer in Shanghai. Each person's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and recognizing the kind of unique nature of the material, we'll entertain a few questions after each presentation, but we'll reserve the great bulk of time for the end of the talk, where we can have hopefully a more spirited and interesting discussion. So with that, I turn it over to Tony.
I'm probably going to repeat what I said last year, but I can't remember what I said last year, so I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to talk about my mother's family in China. This has nothing to do with Dad and the tea importing business. So. Her family lived in China from 1864 till my grandfather's death in 1936. I'm going to focus particularly on my great-grandfather, Hunter Corbett, my mother's paternal grandfather. He was a Presbyterian missionary in China from 1864 to his death in 1920. He was born in a log cabin, this one, in 1835 in Leatherwood, which is in western Pennsylvania. His parents were farmers, and he helped in clearing the forests for new fields, planting, reaping, tending to the cows, pigs, and poultry, and helping in the saw and flour mills that his father had built. His family were staunch Scots-Irish Presbyterians who liked, or at least agreed to attend, all-day Sunday services, with very, very long sermons heavy on the teachings of John Calvin and John Knox. While working on one of the mills, Hunter fell into the cogs that were being pulled by horses and was so severely injured that he could no longer do the heavy work on the farm. His father thought he might become work in a store, but ultimately his parents agreed to let Hunter go to college after he graduated as valedictorian from the local academy. He was graduated from Jefferson College, now Washington and Jefferson in Pennsylvania, and during the year at Jefferson, Hunter decided that he wanted to enter the ministry and go to China as a missionary. Why did someone from the backwoods of western Pennsylvania want to become a missionary to China? There is a novel by John Hershey, not one of his best, called The Call, set some years after Hunter decided to become a missionary. Hershey was born in China to missionary parents. The novel explains the influences that made young men and their wives want to go to China and spread the gospel. Hunter was also undoubtedly influenced by an uncle who was the first missionary sent by the U.S. Presbyterian Foreign Missions Board to China. The uncle spent some years in Singapore with the Chinese, not being permitted to enter China proper by the government, the Chinese government. Hunter went to Western Theological Seminary in Allegheny City, which is now part of Pittsburgh, and then to Princeton Theological Seminary, graduated in 1863. His purpose to go to China didn't look like it was going to happen, but just as he was finishing his studies at Princeton, the mission board offered him an opportunity to sail to China in July 1863. He quickly seized the opportunity, which included his ordination as a Presbyterian minister and his marriage to his first wife, Elizabeth Culbertson. Hunter and Elizabeth, called Lizzie, embarked on a 900-ton sailing vessel on July 3rd, 1863, which was a pretty important time during the Civil War. He had to post a bond of $1,000 in case he was drafted for a substitute. They didn't hear the ship. People on the ship didn't hear the results of the Battle of Gettysburg for 100 days until when a swifter ship overtook them. It was a very, very rough voyage that took 6 months, going around the Cape of Good Hope and through the Indian Ocean. The ship was relying on canned food, a relatively new invention, but the canning was faulty and the food was inedible. So they were reduced to eating beans. And every sailor on board but one got scurvy. Hunter had intestinal trouble for many years thereafter, and he said in his diary he never again would suffer beans to be served at his table. When Hunter and Lizzie arrived in Shanghai in January 1864, Hunter was carried off the ship on a stretcher, and the doctors gave him 1 year to live if he stayed in China. He reportedly said, "If it is to be 1 year, I'll devote it to China." In any event, he served as a missionary in China for 57 years, with occasional furloughs back to the U.S. From Shanghai, Hunter and Lizzie, with a few other missionaries, sailed to the Shandong Peninsula. After living in a couple of places, including an abandoned temple that everyone thought to be haunted, they bought a parcel of property on Temple Hill in Chifu, which is now called Yantai, and is on the northern side of the peninsula. The house that they built and expanded was very comfortable and was the center of life for the Corbett family for generations. It was torn down by a mob in 1950 or so. Of particular interest was the floor, thought to be covering vast wealth, which, of course, Presbyterian missionaries tended not to have. Tended not to have. Hunter had 3 wives, sequentially. He wasn't a Mormon. Elizabeth, Mary, and Harriet, who was my mom's grandmother. The first 2 died. Harriet survived Hunter and died in 1936 in Chifu. Each of the wives had 4 children, all born in China, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. They were referred to as the ancients, the medievals, and the moderns. There was quite an age difference between the first ancient, born in 1866, and the last modern, born in 1894. One of my grandfather's nephew, my grandfather being a modern, and his nephew being an ancient, George Hayes, were only 2 years apart. George Hayes actually ended up having a very distinguished military career, including commanding the 10th Mountain Division in World War II. In Chifu, Hunter had a church built. He was the architect and the supervisor of construction. He displayed abundant faith by building a meeting place to seat 200, though there were only 2 local church members on the day of dedication. He struggled with the language at first, which I understand because I took 2 years of Chinese in college, but with the help of a close personal friend, he became fluent in it and was able to translate various works from English into Chinese. He ensured that all his children became fluent in Chinese. Schools, the missionaries in Chifu built schools and medical facilities. The graduates of the boys' school went to an arts college, liberal arts college, and were taught both Chinese and Western fields of study, including mathematics with Arabic numerals, using pencil and paper rather than an abacus. This form of mathematics was called in Chinese pui xuan, or pencil counting. Hunter also built a museum with stuffed animals, model engines, and other curiosities, including a stuffed Bengal tiger and the skeleton of a 2-headed calf, which were the prized exhibits. It was connected to a chapel, and the price of admission to the museum was sitting through a preaching session. In 1902, 83,346 people, Hunter liked to keep very accurate statistics, visited the chapel and the museum. From Chifu, Hunter went on trips, sometimes with his family, into the interior for 3 or so more months to preach and look after small missions. They were often met with considerable hostility and violence, if not indifference. In one case, he fled with his family under a hail of stones after a mob was stirred up to get rid of the foreign devils. The work did grow steadily. Several dozen schools were established in the interior by Hunter and other missionaries. In 1883, Hunter baptized 250 persons, and in 1908, he preached and distributed tracts in a total of 1,641 towns and villages. He liked accuracy. Getting back to the family, Elizabeth, his first wife, died in 1873. In 1875, Hunter, with his 3 surviving children, went on his first furlough to the U.S., preaching and raising money for the Chinese missions. While there, he married his second wife, Mary Nixon, and returned to China. Shortly after returning to China, there was a severe famine in the north of China, and the missionaries all got together Protestant, Catholic, all kinds of different Protestants and Catholics, and worked to alleviate it. And afterwards, hostility in that part of China towards the missionaries was greatly reduced. Mary was ill for a long period of time, and Harriet Sutherland, who had been born in Ontario to Scots immigrants and had trained as a nurse, was on her way to Hunan province as a medical missionary, but stopped in Chifu to learn Chinese and nurse Mary through her last illness. After Mary died in 1888, one thing led to another, and Hunter and Harriet were married in 1889, somewhat to the surprise of the missionary community, as Harriet was 24 years younger than Hunter. Harriet was my mother's paternal grandmother and therefore my great-grandmother. For a honeymoon, Hunter and Harriet went into the country for the regular fall tour, returning after 55 days. A honeymoon in the country, spending nights in inns, small churches, and schools, left something to be desired. Quoting from Hunter's diary, quote, "A school or church where everybody feels that he or she has the right to enter at any time and stay indefinitely is certainly not favorable to rest or anything else," I might add. Many of the people find it difficult to realize that they do not have the liberty of a public place and cannot rush into our bedroom and examine everything as before. One of the entries in his diary records, quote, "Such a night I have never spent in China. We tried it first on the kang, which is a brick bed that could be heated in winter, and finding it swarming with fleas, we moved to a bed covered with sacks of corn, hoping to find sleep. We were doomed to disappointment. Investigation the next morning revealed that the bed was full of a peculiar bug called chow chung. We would call them bed bugs. Small but intensely fierce," he said. Harriet and Hunter's first child, Ross John, called Jack by his family, was born on August 6, 1890. Jack was Mom's father and therefore my grandfather. On Hunter's last furlough in 1906, he was elected moderator of the General Assembly of the then Northern Presbyterian Church, which I understand was sort of a big deal. He spent almost a year in the States visiting churches throughout the country to raise money for the missions in China. He returned to China in April 1907 and died there on January 7th, 1920, at the age of 84. His son, Jack, was educated at the Chinese Inland Missionary School in Chifu and then sent to the U.S. to attend Franklin College in Indiana. There he met a fellow student, Catherine Kenny, who had been born and brought up in Peru, Indiana, incidentally with Cole Porter. Jack was graduated in 1911 and went back to China in 1912 to work for the Standard Oil Company of New York. Catherine was graduated in 1913 with honors in mathematics. As an aside, her grandchildren did not inherit that gene. She sailed to China in the company of a chaperone. She and Jack were married on the day she landed in Shanghai, as it would not have been appropriate for an unmarried woman to be on her own. Jack and Catherine had two daughters, my Aunt Catherine and Harriet, my mother. They lived in various places in China, including Changsha, Yingtiang, Suzhou, Mukden, and Manchuria, finally going back to Shanghai. Harriet was born in the Yale Mission Hospital in Changsha, which is the capital of Hunan Province, on December 30th, 1917. At the time, there was much political unrest in Hunan. Sometimes the city would be held by the Northern Army, and sometimes an army from the south would take control. Mao was born close to Shanghai, by the way. Mom used to tell me that during the 4 years they lived in Manchuria, the winters were the coldest she had ever felt in her life. And the winters in the Northeast Kingdom in the 25 or so years Mom and Dad lived here after retiring just didn't compare. On returning from Manchuria to Shanghai, Harriet and Catherine attended the Shanghai American School. They were somewhat older than the Allmans and the Freemans, although their parents were friends. Their father, Jack, was on the board of the school and general manager of the Standard Oil Company's Shanghai office, with responsibility for the company's operations in North China when he suddenly died in late 1935 and the family moved back to the States. My immediate family therefore managed to escape internment by the Japanese, although one of my great aunts was interned in Shanghai and eventually released and sailed on the Gripsholm with June's family, although I don't think they knew each other. But so that's about it on my family.
I want to first acknowledge the source of materials for my talk. So I used primarily my grandmother's diary, his 5-year diary from the early 1930s that she kept in China. My great-grandfather's diary of the same time period, and in particular, this is just an amazing book called Captives of Empire, the Japanese Internment of Allied Civilizations in China, 1941 to 1945. And Greg Leck, been in touch with him, and he provided all the photographs, the scanned photos that I'm going to be showing on the PowerPoint. And he also provided a couple of the videos that are in the exhibit. So sometimes the videos have been working and sometimes not. So if not, and you haven't had a chance to see them, they're pretty interesting. And I just want to thank Michael for putting together the PowerPoint, because I did not do that. So I'm just going to do a really short background on family. So my mom, Margaret Bascom, was a third generation in her family to live in China, and her maternal grandparents, Warwick and Florence Winston, lived in Tientsin, and that's where my grandmother, Bess Hale, who became Hale, was born. My grandmother, Bess, met my grandfather, who would be my grandfather, Bill Hale, in Shanghai, and they also lived in Tientsin. They sort of had a duplex, sharing it with the Winstons, and eventually moved to Shanghai, but that's my mom and my Uncle Ted in front of the house there. And then once they moved to Shanghai, my other uncle was born, Rich, and that's the three of them in their Shanghai house. My grandfather worked for American International Group, known as AIG, which was the tie to the Freeman's family. He was the banker for the business. So they were all living in Shanghai when, in 1939, the Japanese attacked China and took occupation of Shanghai. And at the time, they really had no consideration of leaving, because this was their home for 2 generations. There was no sort of returning home to go to. And really, up until December of 1941, they had no indication from the U.S. government and the Home Office, which was for AIG, which was then in New York, that there was any escalation of aggression by the Japanese. And then the next day, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So it was a surprise to everybody. But what a lot of the U.S. citizens didn't realize is that that the Japanese had already been taking over a lot of other countries in the meantime, and cities. So this is not a very easy map to see, so forgive me, but on March, I'm going to just jump ahead. So on March 3rd, 1943, the Hales were interned in the Chapay internment camp, which was formerly the Great China University, one of many internment camps, about 10 or 11 that were in Shanghai. And the Japanese called them the civilian assembly centers, and there were over 8,000 enemy nationals housed in these camps just in Shanghai. There were over 1,000 in Chapay, which was an upper left corner, is where the camp was. And just for curiosity, right about, I'm going to lose my orientation, but right about here is where my family had their house there in Shanghai. And I only mention that because Bess's parents, the Winstons, were able to stay home, stay in that house during their internment. So this is a photo, an aerial photo of Chappé. So all they had in their room at camp was really what they brought with them. So packing, as you imagine, was a nightmare. They had limitation in space. And they had their beds and whatever they could pack among the springs within the bed. They had, folding chairs. They had, just a few things that I could discern from the diaries. But they put their clothes, buckets, basins, cookware, and what my grandmother called other knobbly things into 2 steamer trunks, and that's what they took with them. And my grandmother lamented when she was packing for camp that, quote, "There's so much in the house to be sorted and packed that my mind is like a squirrel cage." I could just imagine just spinning around. So there was at least one internee who was a teacher at Shanghai American School who who took books instead of her own personal property belongings so that she could use them towards teaching the students at the school, at the camp. And another internee said, quote, "I was particularly impressed by the lack of everything." They got there was nothing. If they didn't bring it in, they just didn't have it. So this is a plan of a room. This is in the exhibit. I don't remember. So this is a room that holds 28 women. But regardless, the dimensions, the formula is still the same. The rooms were very crowded. The Hale shared a 15-foot by 34-foot room with 14 others. And this included a friend who was their doctor, his wife and her 3 children, and her mother, who was the Shanghai American School librarian. And also, they were good friends, and so their daughter was at school with my mom. And then they had 2 young twins. A mother and son from the Netherlands, and another husband and wife from the U.S., American. And they basically had 36 square feet per person, which is about 2 of these tables, is what it averaged for that space. Just a stunning lack of privacy when you think about it. My grandmother wrote in the diary that she had to step on the bed of one of the other women to get into her bed. So this next picture is a little bit out of context. Everyone looks really happy because this is Liberation Day 2 years later. So this is 1945. And I included it. Greg sent it to me. I have the listing of the people whose numbers are there with names. He was wondering if my mom recognized anybody. But that's the building they were in. And what's circled is their room. Those 3 windows are the windows to the room that she and her family lived in. We were able to suss that out based on a number. It's been really interesting doing some of this research. So when they were in camp, of course, my grandmother was really gravely concerned about what was going to happen to her parents. They were left in the house. There was very little communication. At one point, it was assumed that they would eventually be interned, but they didn't know. They also didn't know, of course, how long they would be interned. So just a lot of worry for her children and her husband. There were rumors about the war and reparations, but they never got reliable news. And so whatever information that they heard from the Japanese and the people on the outside heard about the camp was all propaganda. They would read stuff and say, well, they were talking about how wonderful the camps are and how much food they get and all this other things, which of course was far from the truth. So before people went to camp, they thought they'd have a lot of leisure time. And there was no leisure time to speak of because they had to do everything. They had their day-to-day common chores. They had, clean, washing up, hauling and heating water for washing clothes and bed linens, and gathering coal and wood and whatnot. But then there was anyone who was physically able had a community job as well. So they would share the work of the camp. So some examples that I could suss out was Bess, Marg, and Ted did a lot of scullery duty, or what Bess called kitchen police, scraping carrots and potatoes, and their favorite was cleaning scales off of the fish. And then my mom, Marg, did a lot of stuff with the kids, play, in the playground and what they called this daycare. I had a name for it. My Uncle Ted did a lot of different things. He did messengering, infirmary duty. He unloaded food supply trucks and did meat grinding. all at various, different times. And my grandfather, who was at AIG, did finance work. I mean, he was the banker. There were a lot of course, businessmen here that often they tried to use their expertise in different jobs. Bill was also a floor monitor, and he did some cooking. And then my Uncle Rich, who was much younger, did some gardening and tending of the animals. And I read one day when he went out, he was working outside the fence. And being 7, I think the guards tended to take little kids out to do that type of work because they weren't going to run away because their parents and family were back in the camp. And when he was out there, he saw their gardener from their house walk by, but of course he couldn't call to him and bring any attention to him. But it was sort of an interesting sort of connection to the outside world that day. Some of the other jobs, cleaning bathrooms, cleaning the buildings and grounds, plumbing, carpentry, hauling garbage, being in the library. There was sign making. There was a lot of committee work. One person described the camp as like, quote, a small municipality with no assets whatsoever except manpower and a few people with ideas. And that just came across so strongly in the diary and in Greg Leck's book. There were enough people willing to step up, and what they said is to work to create a good community life. This is a kitchen plan. And all the pictures, this is all of Chapé. This book covers all the different internment camps in China, and in Shanghai. No, in the Shanghai area. But the upper section is where they did the cooking and cleaning, the wash basin, and then the lower part is where people came in and were served the food. This next thing just sort of shows, it was in the book, some of the committee assignments. It's the government table. And the ones that are circled are ones that my families were involved with. My grandmother really dreaded the job, but was really encouraged to run for the executive committee. And it's listed at the top. Her name isn't on that piece because that happened. Her group got voted in over the people that are currently listed on that top section. But she really did this very reluctantly, but if anyone knows my grandmother, she did it very successfully and was an excellent advocate with the camp commandant for the other internees. She said the worst part of it was managing the personalities. You can imagine it was very political. And she described, quote, the difficulty of running a place smoothly and efficiently when the labor is on its own. So, there was really whatever they made of it. And while there were disagreements among internees, there were some who just didn't carry their weight. But overall, things really ran smoothly, and I read about a number of the other camps where that wasn't the case. Somebody described it this way, quote, there was a tacit understanding that nerves were too taut to have disputes deliberately brought on. Just couldn't afford the luxury of not getting along. Excuse me. This building plan on the left of the three stories of the building where they were, and again circling where the room that they had there. It's pretty much where they slept and occasionally prepared food and ate, and did relax during those rare downtimes. The three-story building also contained the scullery, the bakery, the butchery, the kitchen galley, an infirmary, a barber and dentist, and storerooms. And then the other three-story building on the left, which is actually the west building, and the one on the left is the east building, was all residential quarters and the commandant's office, and an office for the committee, executive committee to use. And the buildings were really leaky and really cold in the winter, obviously, and steaming hot in the summer. So this is another picture, a drawing of a bird's eye view of the camp. The outbuildings were really these long contractor-style sheds with corrugated, metal roofs. Contained showers, assembly hall, a church, a library, canteen, and storage again. But many of the buildings were just open sheds, so that's where they had the classrooms and where the few animals that were there, the laundry, entertainment, carpenter shop, were all in these sort of more open side buildings. Poor. So that's a great question. So I'll mention it in a little bit, but each of the in the buildings, you'll see that there's bathrooms in them. There's a men's and a women's in each floor, and they had toilets that flushed. So in that regard, they were quite fortunate. But they were still just managing the waste of food byproducts and whatnot. So I'm going to go, this next one, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this shows. This picture is also in the exhibit, but the building there is the laundry shed. So trying to, doing laundry obviously is a major chore in and of itself. And this washing machine, what they call the washing machine, is basically a stick with a tin can on it, and they'd put little scraps of soap in it, and they'd bang the up and down in a container with water. But they needed to haul and heat the water to wash the clothes. And there's a washing stick in the exhibit. It's a miniature, and it was given to my grandmother by some of the women in thanking her for her work on the executive committee. So it was sort of tongue-in-cheek of the women's advocating for the women to have better conditions in which to do a lot of their work. So trying to wash bed linens this way, it just didn't work. She would just write over and over again, I dread trying to, and you had to wait for good weather because you had to hang them out to dry. So they finally got permission and salvaged materials to build a laundry shed. And that's pretty much what it looked like, which was much easier to do the linens that way. They built it, and days later there was a typhoon that hit the area, and a lot of the other sheds lost the roof, but the laundry shed hung in there. And at the christening of the shed, one man said, "We hope we find the shed of great assistance for a very short time," basically hoping for repatriation. So this is not a great picture, but you can see that's actually over on the left. Oh, sorry. Over on the left is the laundry shed, and you can see where the clothes are hanging out, just catch as catch can. And I asked Mom, he's like, did these things ever get taken or, stolen by other people to use? And she's never, that would just have been too low. People just left your stuff alone and you came back for it later. So here's a picture of the food line in the kitchen. Needless to say, the food was poor and inadequate to meet the nutritional needs of everybody. It came from a variety of sources. It came from the Japanese Army supplies, rations that they had, the International Red Cross. They'd get infrequent packages from home. They were sent more frequently. They just didn't arrive very often or be delivered very often. A lot of times there was this thing called comfort allowance that was provided by respective governments, and they would use that money to purchase food. Food deliveries were often lost or spoiled, or they got delayed in being delivered. They would just hold them, and the food would go bad. And requisitions for supplement food was often turned down, and again, delayed in the delivery. Rules and forms were needed for everything and would be changed frequently. Bess wrote that she, quote, sent out a letter to Mother on the form that was in vogue at present. It was unnecessary. It was just more the Japanese way of harassing the prisoners and the internees as much as they could. The cracked wheat, which was left over from 1930 famine relief, and rice that they had always needed to be picked through debugging, they called it, to remove larvae and weevils and rat droppings and dirt and whatever else. And that was constant work that had to be done. And the food was prepared on coal stoves and in huge Chinese cauldrons that are called kongs. Does that sound right, Tony? Okay. The meals were eaten in the common area where the internees would queue up, and apparently there was just a whole lot of queuing up that went on in camp. You got in line for everything. Occasionally the Hales did cook in their room, and they used canned heat. I had not heard that term before. But I just knew it as a band back in the 60s. But they would, if they had canned heat, and if not, they used a candle stove or an egg boiler occasionally. But of course, they, as everybody in camp, lost weight. And my grandfather they all had birthdays while they were at the camp, and he weighed 127 on his 48th birthday. And he weighed a lot less than that by the time he got back to the States. But he eventually suffered permanent hearing loss from the malnutrition. I think he gave a lot of his food to the kids. So sanitation, there was limited access to hot and cold water. there was one wash basin and one toilet for every 18 internees and one shower for every 46 internees, just to give you a scope of what they had. And the showers were an outbuilding, so you had to walk out to the showers, of course, and then come back. And they originally only had cold water, but eventually they built a boiler and were fitted with hot water not too long after they got there. My mother said it's because the Japanese were so fastidious, they insisted that that even the internees be as clean as they would want themselves to be. I don't know how you do it with that ratio of showers, but it was better than many, many of the other camps in that regard. Again, bathrooms had flush toilets, but no toilet seats. Which, if you think about it, makes sense if you're trying to, just makes sense. So a roommate of the, I was going to say is that also there was a really severe epidemic of dysentery. And so all those types of things make these types of conditions even worse, of course. But one of their roommates had a toilet seat. So that was a really prized possession. And you did not let it out of your grasp when you were walking down the hall. But you'd see people, they say you'd see people just wandering the halls with these little wooden contraptions, and that, basically there was no room for false modesty. You knew where everyone was going when they were going there. So I'm just going to show, just so we don't have to look at a toilet, show this picture, which is a panoramic of the camp. And my grandmother has this. It's in the studio, It's in the exhibit. I just wanted to put it up here for this next piece. So lighting, again, they didn't have a lot of electric lights, lights out at 9 o'clock at night on most nights, but they did have really dim, low wattage bulbs, like 10 watt, 25 watt in the hallways and in the bathroom. So other places, they had no lights at night, and they went into the bathrooms with no lights. So again, Chappé had some improvements that some of the others didn't have. What they didn't have was screening material to cover the windows. So mosquitoes and the flies were just horrendous in the summer months, and eventually they did get some screening material to put in place. And there were parts of camp that had bed bugs and lice and all the things you might expect in a condition with so many people living together. There was an epidemic of whooping cough that affected 75 children. There was an outbreak of measles. There was, it said, dysentery, stomach flus, pneumonias. Acute diarrhea. A baby died from dehydration from diarrhea within days. And my grandmother talked about debilitating lassitude, just exhaustion. And it's not a word you hear much anymore. So the other thing that the sicknesses did is it compounded the problem of having enough people to do work. So if you had a whole lot of people getting sick, and the work even increased at that point. At one point, my mom was in bed with a stomach upset and was feeling very dizzy and sort of seasicky, sort of that dizziness that you get. And Bess wrote in reference to repatriation that how I wish Marg's seasickness could be authentic. It's very much on their mind. So the internees were really creative in how they, and their wry wit with a number of different things. There were a lot of poems that they wrote that we have copies of and that are in the Captives of Empire. But there was the librarian who was in their room had made this cross-stitch thing for the room that says, "God bless our home." It's in the exhibit also. I don't know how they just chose to bring these things back, but it was obviously tongue-in-cheek. They put on birthday parties for kids. The couple, the woman put on a party for 50 kids when her twins turned 5 or whatever it was. It's just crazy. Plays, variety shows. They had sports competitions. That was really common across all the camps, from what I could tell. Just trying to keep some sort of sense of normality in a time where it's really unstable. How am I doing on time, Michael?
23 minutes.
Oops, shoot. Okay. Almost done. People okay? So I mentioned about their rules and regulations that just didn't make sense, and denying requests. There was problems occasionally when people would disobey the camp rules, and the commandant would punish everybody. Right? That's what you might expect. So there was one point where a message was being passed outside the fence by an internee, and that was discovered. And he was, they thought he was actually going to be mortally punished, as happened in other camps, but instead he just ended up with 9 days of confinement, but then they took the whole camp out to the parade grounds, gave them warning, sent them back, and put them on 2 days of restrictions and no showers or water or anything. And again, it was just, you know, how they would be tormented and kept in place. So almost there. So anticipating the repatriation, Bess and my mom would try to pack luggage in these tight restrictions, and you'd get everything sorted, and then you have to put them back in there because you'd need to get on the bed to sit or to eat or something. So it was just this turmoil of trying to figure out what they were going to do when they would leave, and also not knowing. Bess was really worried that her husband Bill was not going to make it on the list. It was very common for men to be left behind. And on September 11th, Inaba, who's the assistant to the commandant, stopped Bess in the hallway and came up to her and said, "Your husband, he is on the list." And she just felt so grateful that he was willing to tell her that. And so she had like 3 or 4 more days not being left in the dark. But it was still uncertain. But the day came when it was listed and posted. And I think, actually, I've been falling down the job. This is the bulletin board where they would post things. And this is, of course, where they posted the list once it was determined. And her last diary entry 2 days later confirmed that Bill was on the list, and she wrote, quote, "Almost finished on this diary, wonder if and when we will see it again." And I still don't know, Mom didn't have any idea how she managed to smuggle the diary into camp to begin with and then out on the other end, because they searched everything that were in the trunks that they were allowed to take with them, because they weren't allowed to take any written materials. So she did something. Leave it to Bess. So they ended up, those on the list would leave Shanghai on September 19th and arrive in New York Harbor on December 1st.
What year?
Good question, 1943. This last picture, and I'm going to tell one story. So that's my grandparents in front of Rocky Point here in Greensboro, and my mom and her 2 brothers in front of the Poplars, our cottage at the lake. So this last story, years later, Bill and Bess had a dinner party at their house. They were living in Scarsdale, New York at the time. And during cocktails, they somehow got discussing snoring, and somebody surmised that Bill snored. And without missing a beat, Mrs. Dunn immediately popped in and said, "Oh, Bill doesn't snore." With a dead silence. Why would this woman know that my grandfather didn't snore? So Mrs. Dunn was the mother of the 3 kids that shared the room in camp with the Hales and knew firsthand that it was actually my grandmother that snored, not Bill. So anyway, so thank you for the opportunity to share some of my mom's and family's story.
Why was Chappé better than the other camps?
I don't know. There might be more in that, but I do know that the commandant, Chusami, I'm not probably pronouncing that right, Sunam, I'm not going to say it without it in front of me, had come from, Michael, I was telling you about that. He had a couple of roles where he was highly experienced, and he had a larger role of overseeing all the local camps in the Shanghai area, and that he had expressed how well the camp had been run, again, by the people that were there. So part of it might, even though that they also were very strict, and eventually they were taken out of that camp and that commandant because of some suggestions of embezzlement. I just read that today. But I think it very much has to do with the combination of people that are there and just the combination of what the camp had to offer. So maybe having flush toilets and hot water made people more amenable than places like Stanley Camp where Eliza's grandfather was, that had no hot water of any sort. I don't know. It's a great question. My guess it was a combination of factors.
I'm wondering how much they knew about the political situation and whether they were being, were they going to be, were they hostages? Why were they being held, and did they have any idea what use they were to the judges?
As internees?
Yeah, so were they bargaining chips in some way? What were the Japanese, why did they just kill them?
They were enemies.
Well, no. Why didn't they just kill them?
That would have wreaked havoc in the net.
So they were holding them just until the end of the war.
They did a lot. They did a lot more once the Americans took it wasn't intern. I've forgotten the term that they used for the Japanese Americans, and things turned much worse for the Americans in Shanghai as soon as that happened. And there were a number of things that were referenced in my grandmother's diary that said that they were taking out on them once they found out how badly the Japanese Americans had been treated. But they just couldn't leave them around. That's why the elders were left in the homes, because they were pretty innocuous. They weren't going to be able. They weren't a threat. But again, they were trying to also contain any contact with the outside world. So at Stanley Camp, again, which was almost more like a POW setup, there were a radio was discovered there, and 7 of the internees were shot. And actually, there was reporting that many more were. It's just that's all they reported. Because they didn't want any communication about what was going on. So you sort of have to contain the people at that point. Eliza, do you have more to say about that?
Yeah. Very simply, what happened is after Pearl Harbor, all Americans, for instance, were enemies of the Japanese, and the Japanese were in China. So basically, all Americans, be they military or civilians, were considered as enemy and potential threats to the Japanese, and they had to contain them and prevent them from organizing resistance or doing anything whatsoever against the Japanese occupiers.
That's right.
The Japanese brutality during the Second World War has been pretty well established. And it was very surprising to me that they weren't more brutal in China.
They were very brutal in China. So during the occupation time, when I talked a little bit about this last year, but before they started interning the Americans and British and other foreign nationals, they brutalized the Chinese and pretty much tortured citizens openly and terrorized anyone who. I mean, it didn't take much to be hauled. They beheaded them. They made them stand in water. I mean, these are things that my mother and my uncles witnessed on their way to and from school. Until they started getting word about how the Japanese Americans had been treated. And then things started changing there too. It wasn't quite the same. It still wasn't the same as how they treated the Chinese. Even in camp, the Chinese that were in the camp with them were treated far worse. So yeah, I think it was, and again, I think there's certain personality, certain people are going to be different. I mean, I'm sure there were compassionate guards that were there. The fact that the assistant came and told my grandmother that. I think the reason why my grandfather made it on the boat was because of the work they did on the committee work. But everyone in their room got on that repatriation ship, the Teo Maru, that went back on the Gripsome and that met up with the Gripsome, except for one man. And I read in the diary that he had been blamed for some political aspect of the committee work that he was not at fault for, but he had been scapegoated. And I can't help but wonder whether that might have been why he was taken off the list at the last minute. So, there's a lot that we don't know, that I don't know about the particulars.
Okay, I'm going to talk about my grandfather, whose name is Norwood Francis Allman. And just by way of explanation of the family connections here, Norwood was married to Mary Louise. They had 3 children, Bill, Nancy, and John. And some of you may have known my Uncle Bill or my mother Nancy, who lived most of her adult life in Paris. And the 3 kids, Bill, Nancy, and John, were all born in China. And my grandfather married a missionary's daughter. His wife was born in China to missionary parents, so similar to Tony's family. So what's interesting about my grandfather is that he was a man of few words, of very caustic wit, and he loved the simple life of Greensboro, and nothing would give you a clue as to the fact that he led this grand life in China for all those years. And in fact, nothing in his background really predestined him to such a life, because he grew up on a farm in Virginia, and they were poor. There were 9 kids, 8 brothers, and 1 sister. And he was able to attend law school at the University of Virginia for 1 year. But after that, there was no money for him to continue at University of Virginia. But he was very headstrong, and so he decided that he was going to go to Mexico because there were lots of big American corporations, and he was going to land a great job in Mexico and make it big so he could get his law degree from University of Virginia. So off he goes to Mexico. The plan does not work, no job. But somebody tells him to go talk to the consul, and he doesn't know what a consul is or what a consul does. So he goes to see the U.S. consul, and he says to him, well, this is quite a racket you've got going here. Gets thrown out. The hillbilly from Virginia is told to go home. He gets home, and he decides that he's going to go and check it out in Washington. So he arrives in Washington. He finds out that you can enter the consular service without a university degree, just so long as you pass the entrance examinations. So he takes them and he passes, to everybody's surprise, including his own. And so that's how he became a student interpreter to go to China. Now, he could have either gone for a consular job or become a student interpreter. This was very interesting. It was a State Department program that was initiated in that period because they knew that they needed diplomats that could speak Japanese, Chinese, and Turkish, the difficult languages. So he had a choice of Constantinople, Tokyo, or Peking. He chose Peking because, according to the World Almanac, that country had the largest population, which at the time was 450 million people already. So off he went to Peking to become a student interpreter. The program...
Tell us what time we're talking about?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. This is 1916. 1916.
Okay, thank you.
So the program, the student interpreter program, was right, during World War I, and they were very keen to get people to go because, those were difficult times. The program was supposed to be 6 years, and they were supposed to study the language, the customs, the history, the culture of the country. And he thought it was a really good deal because he said it was all at government's expense. So instead of 6 years, he studied for 4 years on account of the war and because there was not enough consular personnel. Their language instruction was with old elderly Chinese gentlemen, professors, who, according to him, were just as ignorant of teaching methods as we were of their language. Their method was to read these strange sounds to us, hand us the book, and tell us to read the sounds back to them while they dozed off. And what they really had to do was to go out and to practice with the coolies and the servants and the merchants, whoever they could get their hands on, and whoever was willing to speak, Chinese with the foreign devils. So one of his early assignments was to go and haggle in the marketplace with an antique dealer on behalf of the consul, because the consul knew that if he went, he would be gouged for money by the antique dealer, and if he sent the lowly student interpreter, he would get a good price. So he managed to learn Chinese by any way that he could. And in terms of their consular instruction, they had one big manual. It was kind of a Bible. It was called the Book of Rules. And the only rule apparently that mattered in this whole book was the following one. Always send a cable or telegram as if the receiver were a damn fool. Leave nothing unexplained. And he said, he was very funny, and he said that he always put this to good advantage. So while he was a student interpreter, he had to carry out consular duties. They were getting initiated into the job. And so, for instance, back in those days, consular officers would take all day to write these endless cables about the events taking place. They thought they were writing for history. And then the poor student interpreters had to cipher the cables at nighttime because everything got ciphered. And then the consul would come in the morning and say, well, I've changed the cable. When he eventually finished his course, he was shunted from one post to another as there was a shortage of staff. He had duties that were very typical of consular officers, that were trivial and all to do with protocol, determining the right seating arrangement according to what's called precedence, that is, who can sit next to whom without offending anybody because of their rank. But he also had to do all kinds of things that required thinking out of the box, as we would say today, and thinking on your feet, because the situation in China then was completely unstable, and strange situations were occurring all over the time. And I'd like to say a couple of words about the situation in China then, because They had overthrown the Manchu dynasty in 1911. Basically, it was a revolution. Then there was civil unrest, civil war. It was chaos. There was no real government, civil government, no real institutions, but there were a bunch of warlords all over the place that just couldn't stop fighting each other. So you had fighting erupting all over the place most of the time. And you had a legal system that was completely archaic, unfair, inefficient. So it was really not wonderful for the foreigners. And that's why they tended to manage their own affairs. So he was first posted in Antung, and I'm not going to go through all his various postings, but just to give you a little bit of the flavor of what it was like. This was on the border between Manchuria and Korea, and every time he went from one posting to another, it involved endless travel on steamers and trains. It took 36 hours, 5 days, whatever. And already the Japanese infiltration in Manchuria was starting. So he got to his first position, and after a few hours, he was just raring to go, and he went to see the consul. He said, "Okay, what's my duty? What do I do?" And he was told, "Just take care of my goats." Then he went to Tientsin in 1919, and he was vice consul. Now, this was the center of the Mongolian wool trade, and this is where they made rugs as well. Just in this city that was sort of a medium size, there were 13 foreign concessions and 14 different city governments. So he cut his teeth, and he was starting to get used to consular routine, and then he was sent on to Jinan, which is the capital of the Shantung province. Jinan is where my mother was born. It's one of the most densely populated parts of the world. It's also, interestingly enough, and you'll love this little bit of trivia, capital of the hairnet industry in the world. What did they do? They would cut good Chinese hair, send it back to France to be bleached. It came back to China to be made into hairnets and went back to Europe to be sold. So this is, we always talk about trade. It was going on already then. And here, one of the first serious incidents that he encountered that he had to deal with, and where he really had to, nothing that was covered in the manual instruction for consular officers. There had been a student rebellion against the Japanese encroachment, because the students tend to be sort of the vanguard of intellectual rebellion and movement against the Japanese. The students were arrested, and the Chinese, basically in a situation like that, because they had rebelled, would have shot them. A few of them managed to escape, and so they descended on the British consulate and the U.S. consulate and asked them to intercede on their behalf with the Chinese authorities, which they did, and so they were not shot. So Norwood here sums up his view of world diplomacy, and basically the split between the grand declarations in diplomacy and what happens on the ground in the real world. He says, "I was fully aware of the State Department's disapproval of such interference in internal Chinese politics. At the same time, I knew that a number of students were about to be shot for vociferously upholding the very principles we were advocating at Versailles. Versailles being, of course, the treaty that ended World War I. So he was already quite aware of some of the hypocrisy inherent in diplomacy. Then in 1920, he ended up in Tsingtao, and I would like to say a couple words about Tsingtao because, everybody knows about Tsingtao beer. Now, but do we know why we have Tsingtao beer? Well, the German presence in Tsingtao goes back to 1877, and when 2 Roman Catholic missionaries were murdered. The Germans used it as a pretext, and they seized the whole peninsula. Tsingtao is known as being one of the perfect harbors in the world. So they got themselves a 99-year lease. Does that sound familiar? And then they built a modern city, and they planted pine trees that makes it look a little bit like Monterey in California. It's a very beautiful place. And the Germans were very solidly entrenched and happily established, and that's why there was a brewery and hence the beer. And it's only in 1944 that the Japanese came along and pushed the Germans out. So when he got to Tsingtao, he had very, very odd instructions for a diplomat. He was told, you reopen the consulate, but you do not have official relations with the Japanese, because the Japanese by that time were actually in there. They had established a military presence in Tsingtao. So it gives you an idea of how fluid and crazy things were. You had a Chinese government, but you had a Japanese occupier in a major city, and he could not have official relations with the Japanese because he was accredited to the Chinese. However, he was supposed to cultivate them socially. So socialize with them and try to figure out what's going on. Then his next posting was in Chongqing in Sichuan province. And by now, he was married, and he had a 2-month-old baby, Bill. To get to Chungking, they had to travel up the Yangtze Rapids. And to do that, you went on one steamer, and then you went on a smaller steamer, and then you went on a smaller steamer, and at one point you get pulled up by a cable. It was rather dangerous, and there were warring factions on either side of the Yangtze. So when he got there, the consul was very unhappy with him and scolded him because he had exposed his wife and his baby to this danger. So this is what he said, and again, this is typical. He said that his wife had been through the Boxer Rebellion as well as a number of civil wars and survived, and that his son might as well get used to it.
Sounds like the grandfather.
In this town, it's kind of interesting. It was a walled town, and they had very, very narrow streets, and they had to ride in what's called a sedan chair, which was basically a chair carried by 4 strapping fellows who were probably actually very skinny. And you had 2 Ching Ping Ts who ran in front of you. These were 2 guys who would say, "The great man comes," and he was supposed to clear the streets that way. And so my grandfather was so embarrassed that he would have my grandmother sit in the sedan chair, and he would walk behind trying to be inconspicuous. So then he got appointed full consul to Shanghai, and the consul in Shanghai had been warned that Allman did not like red tape and had full contempt for protocol because his reputation already had been made. So they decided that they were going to stick him on the International Mixed Court of Shanghai. And I have to explain what that is. It was set up in 1869, and it was basically a very interesting court. It was meant to sort of settle cases that involved a Chinese and a foreigner, or Chinese who lived in the international settlement. And what they did is that they had a Chinese judge, it was actually a sub-prefect, and then you had a foreigner who was usually a consul or a vice consul who was assigned to that, and they were called assessors. So an assessor was essentially a judge, and they ruled together on the cases. And that's what he did for several years. And I should explain, I wanted to explain something about the international settlement and this whole concept of international settlement, international mixed court, extraterritoriality. The foreigners lived in the international settlements or the concessions. And these were plots of land that had been set aside and reserved for foreigners to live in. And this was back in the mid-19th century when trade was just starting and they'd signed the first trading treaty. And in Shanghai, you had an international settlement and you had a French concession. And at the time, there were mud flats that were submerged at high tide. So the Chinese thought, they were of no value to them whatsoever, and they didn't mind giving them to the Brits and to the Americans. And of course, over time, these areas became very wealthy because foreigners came to live here and to conduct their business. And also, a historical note that's interesting to realize is that in 1842, Shanghai was a small fishing village. In 1840, Hong Kong was a barren rock with a bunch of pirates on it, okay? And these places all flourished because foreigners came, they resided there, and they conducted their business. So let me get back to the International Mixed Court. They tried civil and criminal cases, up to 50 or 60 cases a day, and it went from traffic violations all the way to murder. The official language was Chinese, and it was very exacting work. They had to be up on the law of their own country, on Chinese law, on what's called admiralty law, that is the law of the seas, private and public international law. So even the foreigners who lived in Shanghai in the settlements, they had no idea what was really going on, and they thought, they were immune to the laws and they could get away with anything. But that was not so. They would be tried according to the laws of their own country. And a funny example of the kinds of things that could happen in this system was gambling. Now, gambling absolutely flourished in Shanghai, okay? It went from dog racing to horse racing to JLI to numerous lotteries, and everybody gambled, men, women, all nationalities. So the different countries had different laws on gambling, and some were much more tolerant than others. Mexico, in particular, had a very soft law on gambling. They had to pay something like 500 pesos if you were caught, doing it. And so everybody had a Mexican front man if they wanted to, set up gambling, who would go in and get, fined his 500 pesetas and everything was fine. let me see. And then they tried a lot of complicated case, and some were interesting in when it came to trademark and copyright. And I'm saying this because, as we know, copyright is piracy has always been a problem in China, and it's not something new. It already was the case then. So when books were published in the UK or in the US, they would cost about $3 on average, a nice hardback in Shanghai. So it was promptly copied and then sold for about 30 cents. And, all the foreigners would, of course, wait for the 30 cents edition to come out. So it's very hard to fight against piracy. They published the Webster Collegiate Dictionary, and what they did very cleverly, they did Chinese translations, and they interleaved it in between the English pages. But they goofed because they left the page with a trademark on it. So they got caught by the International Mixed Court for doing it, and they were actually fined. Anyway, eventually the court was closed down because the Chinese were dissatisfied with it, and the Americans and the British thought that the time for extraterritoriality had run its course. So my grandfather was getting pretty tired of this because he had to go to the court during the day, and then at nighttime he had to do his regular consular duties. They didn't have entertainment allowance, they didn't have retirement benefits, can you believe it? And they did not have their expenses covered when they were on home leave. So most people went on home leave about every 10 years. So he decided this had been very instructive, very enjoyable, but it was time to move on. And so he decided that he would go into private law. So you remember that he'd only had 1 year of law school at University of Virginia. But back then, you could complete your law studies by studying with, accomplished lawyers, and then learning what you had to learn, and then passing the bar. That was good enough. So that's what he did. And what's interesting is that there was also a United States court for China. It was a real court, like we have courts in the United States, except it was for China. And the reason for that is that before that, small sort of crimes were handled by consular courts, and it was mostly sailors getting drunk and getting into brawls. But as the trade grew, they had to create this court. So he had a lot of work, and there was also a lot of crime, quite frankly. As he says, when the court was created, it created consternation among Americans whose activities were of such nature as to be open to serious interference by a stricter enforcement of the laws of the United States. Shanghai had been the scene of operations of numerous undesirable foreigners, including a great many Americans, ladies of easy virtue, and adventurers of every description, ranging from the shady operator who stayed just inside the law to the garden variety of beachcomber who had found Shanghai easy pickings. It's not a lovely description. But anyway, it meant that they had all kinds of work with all kinds of shysters, with all kinds of, con schemes. And he also had to appear before a half a dozen different national courts. The only court that they refused to go before was a Japanese court, because they said that you would file a motion, you would wait for 2 years, it was dismissed, and anyway you lost. So that was a lost cause. He did not have a lot of lost love for the Japanese in general. So in the law offices, everybody had to be bilingual, and it was taken for granted that lawyers had a working knowledge of all these different kinds of law, including the law of the District of Columbia, the federal courts, and the laws of the 48 states. It's hard to believe that that was so. They had a hard time recruiting people. He was very proud because his firm was the only one that used dictaphones back then, and he was one of 3 American lawyers who could try cases in Chinese. They helped companies that were coming and setting up shops, so they would organize the companies, and then they would be retained by them for all their legal business. And oftentimes they actually had to step in and run the companies when the owners or the managers had to go abroad, or sometimes went abroad and were detained by war, which happened quite a bit. The banks required legal advice all the time because their transactions were very complex and they had so many different nationalities involved. Real estate was also a big source of work because of the title deeds and the concessions and the international settlement. How this worked was that they had deeds to their property, but they were not technically owners. These were called perpetual leases. because they couldn't, under the treaty laws, actually be owners. But the perpetual lease was, as the name indicates, perpetual. So you could actually transfer it and you could use it as collateral. And basically you had to register it with the consulate of your country and with a land registry. So they did a lot of work doing that. Let me see. They had a lot of work trying to chase down counterfeit products because there was the piracy of written works, and already counterfeited goods was a huge problem. For instance, the Ever-Ready battery that you all know. Okay, so they were manufacturing them all over the place in China in small little, factories and selling them for 1/5 the cost of a real Ever-Ready battery. So he had 2 employees in the law firm who were Chinese, whose sole job was to go out there and find counterfeited goods and to then try to get the evidence to catch the people. So they would go out and pose as buyers, and then they would try and get invoices and things like that. So altogether, he had a pretty colorful life, and certainly a very interesting one. Basically, he was in a vibrant city full of different nationalities. They had clubs to socialize. They had 3 race courses. They played polo. They were all excellent horsemen. And he would wake up at dawn, exercise his polo ponies, spend the day at the law firm, play polo, and then socialize in a club in the evening. Of course, you might wonder what happened to family life. Well, we don't really know. I'll just say one last thing about him is that he had 1/3 part to his career, quite by chance. He became the manager and editor of a newspaper. It was called the Shunpao. It was the largest Chinese daily at the time. And the way this happened is that the owner was murdered, and the owner was a friend of my grandfather's. He had a son who was 18 years old, and the son was threatened by the Japanese and said, you either toe the line and publish our propaganda, or you'll have to deal with the consequences. And the consequences were very clear. He would be killed. So he made a deal with my grandfather, who ran the newspaper and had full editorial control. And he did that from 1937 to 1941, at a time when it was very hard to resist the pressure from the Japanese. The Japanese were just huge on propaganda. They were pushing propaganda everywhere that was anti-Western, mostly. So that was sort of his last assignment in China. And I'll finish by saying something about his relationship to the Chinese. He said that the following: I lived among the Chinese for 25 years, and from the first I found them likable. In many ways, they are much like Americans. Neither wealth nor position affects the innate humor or democratic nature of the Chinese. It is as easy to talk to a Chinese leader as it is to a laborer. The coolie can tell and appreciate a joke, even if he may be just one step ahead of starvation. Perhaps one of the reasons that I like the Chinese is because they are individualists too. And they always interacted, befriended, and entertained the Chinese in their home. And they were very disappointed when they arrived in Shanghai to discover that that was not the case for most foreigners who had very little interaction with the Chinese. And it had to do with their backgrounds, the fact that my grandfather was from a modest home, and that he was very down to earth, that he had been a student interpreter. He hated snobs. He couldn't abide people who put on airs. And my grandmother had been the daughter of missionaries, and herself had been a missionary before her marriage, and she taught Chinese. They wanted to go back to China. It was their home, and they had every expectation that they would go back. My grandfather did go back after the war, and he was one of the last Americans to leave in 1950. Thank you.
Great.
I got to know your grandparents quite well during 63, 64, when I was living as their neighbor. I had the impression that your grandfather at one point was associated with a small radio station in New York, and he was broadcasting strongly anti-communist information about anti-Chinese communists. Is that true?
Well, you're asking a difficult question because, yes, he was associated with some radio broadcasts, but what we found out, and I guess it's not a secret, so I might as well tell you, is that we knew that he had worked for the Office of Strategic Services, which, for those of you who don't know, is the precursor of the CIA. during World War II, and he was in charge of one of their Far Eastern departments. He was very closed-mouthed about it. We don't really know what he did, but it appears that he carried on in that line of work for some time, and that what he told his family, at least, was that he was working for some newspaper, and he was part of the overseas press club in New York. So I don't really know what those broadcasts were about. I wish I could answer you, but I do know that basically he was a bit of a spy.
As you were speaking, I was thinking of 1937, 1938 in the Long March, where Joe and Lloyd went shopping and Mao Zedong were starving to death with 1,000 troops going from southwest up toward where your families were. And it seems it's all at the same time, but two different worlds. And especially as they were fighting Chiang Kai-shek at that time, and then switched to fighting the Japanese. I wondered if the families in their diaries mentioned those Chinese that were trying to get the government together and form the Communist Party.
Yes, I chose not to discuss this because it was not really part of his career, and it's a complicated topic, but he actually wrote quite a bit about the rise of communism in China and how it happened. He was very well aware of it, and he actually very early on thought that this was going to be the future of China, and tried to warn a lot of people, but I don't think it really worked. But he was very much aware of what was going on, both with the communist activities, with the nationalist government, and in fact, my grandmother went to school in Wellesley with Chiang Kai-shek's wife, so they were friendly with the Chiang Kai-sheks.
Eliza, do you want to mention his book?
Oh, yeah, sure. My grandfather wrote a book, and it's here. It's called Shanghai Lawyer. It was published in 1943, and a lot of what I said and a lot of the quotes that I mentioned tonight come from his book. It's absolutely hilarious. It's very tongue-in-cheek, and unfortunately, it's out of print.
But it is in the library.
We think it's in the library. Nancy was raising this question. We're not too sure if it's in the library. We haven't checked.
It's there under Greensboro Authors.
Yeah, look under Greensboro Authors. But I recommend, if you're interested in this period, it's absolutely hilarious because, yeah. And Norwood was friendly with Mansfield Freeman. So after the war, Mansfield came up to Greensboro, and he convinced my grandfather, Norwood, to come up and spend a summer here, which my grandfather did, and rented a cottage, which he subsequently bought. So that was directly connected to the Freemans.